You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 13th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
Il 1 gennaio del 2024 l'Italia ha assunto la presidenza del G7. È la settima volta che la nostra nazione ha la responsabilità di guidare il gruppo dei sette.
Giorgia Meloni there, the Italian Prime Minister, speaking ahead of the 50th G7 summit in Puglia. We'll check in on the meeting's agenda and ask what its geopolitical consequences could be. The situation is worsening in Darfur, and there are warnings that the city of Al Fasher could fall to rebels imminently. We'll get the latest from Sudan. South Korea's main opposition leader has been indicted on bribery charges. He's already facing corruption charges and still recovering from being stabbed in January. Is Lee Jae-myung still in pole position to take over as the next president? We'll have a roundup of the world's papers and hear some television news. Plus...
we share a lot of values of craftsmanship, functionality, accessibility, and it felt like they also had a profound interest in us.
More from the 3 days of Design Festival in Copenhagen. And finally, we'll catch up with all the goings-on from Art Basel. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said yesterday that Hamas had proposed numerous changes to a US-backed proposal for a ceasefire with Israel in Gaza, as Israeli forces stepped up air and tank bombardments last night in Rafah and central Gaza. Protesters took to the streets in Argentina last night as the Senate gave initial approval to a bill that's key to Libertarian President Javier Milei's economic reform plans. And China's Premier Li Qiang was officially welcomed in a traditional ceremony in New Zealand's capital city of Wellington today, ahead of a meeting with the country's Prime Minister in the highest level Chinese visit in 7 years. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, the leaders of the G7 countries, the United States, Canada, Germany, France, Italy and Britain, along with the chiefs of the European Council and the European Commission, will meet in Italy today for the 50th summit. I'm joined now by Giorgio Scaturo, who is a London-based Italian reporter and producer, and by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue. Giorgio, is this international annual forum as relevant as it once was?
Well, it surely is for the Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, who is hosting the summit in the aftermath of the European elections, where she came out as the only leader who stood solid and gained support by France and Germany, for instance, at this political shake-up. So she will definitely try to grab the extraordinary opportunity to shine as the European Queen, which means she will try to play a decisive role in electing not only the new EU leaders, but also shape the direction and the future of European policies. And Ukraine, which is a top agenda of this 7th summit in Italy, is a relevant part.
Isabel, this is the first G7 summit since the expansion of the BRICS, a group whose leading members include China and Russia. Is that grouping arguably more important now, particularly when compared to the G7?
Well, certainly some members of the BRICS would say so, but it's a rather crude calculation of how much they represent in terms of global GDP. And these, of course, are very large. I mean, China alone is a large country. There are political problems within the BRICS, however, and indeed economic problems. Argentina is a candidate member with a very, very poor economy. And then you've got tensions between India and China. You have Russia as a member, which is not really, I mean, Putin is not really allowed to travel the world as he would wish. So, yes, it's large, but I think that, and certainly some members of the BRICS would argue that it is the coming configuration of countries, but I think not there yet.
Georgia, as you say, Giorgia Meloni is fresh off the back of these major gains in the European Parliament election over the weekend. She's expected to expand on her major foreign policy plan. I wonder if you could tell us more about that.
Well, definitely she is famous and being praised for her firm support for Ukraine by President Joe Biden, who even, you might remember, kissed her on the head during a visit to the White House. So she is from the far right, but she's trying to claim a role for herself as a moderate leader. And she's trying to play in a position of a bridge, not only between the far and the center right in Europe, but also between the EU and the US. So we know that, for instance, there is an agreement to transfer financial support to Kiev from the talking $50 billion that are generated by the interest on 300 billion Russian frozen assets. This will have to be structured by the leaders today, but also on immigration. She came out as a very hard stance on immigration, which is on the agenda on the recent elections that are looming both in the US and in the UK. And she's basically changing a little bit policies. She came out trying to block the charity ships that were going to rescue the migrants in the Mediterranean. Now she's actually invited the African countries that are neighboring and where the immigrants mainly come from. So she's opened the door to them to start some sort of relationship that will possibly lead to a solution in solving a hot issue such as migration that is relevant to all the G7 countries attending Borgo Egnazia today.
Because, of course, a key part of her Mate plan seeks to help alleviate poverty and exploitation in Africa, and thereby possibly halting the amount of people that want to leave. I mean, Isabel, of course, China has its own version of that. Has the Belt and Road increased Beijing's political clout in developing countries?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, I think developing countries recognise that China turns up and builds the airport. I don't think that either the United States or the European Union have proved very effective so far, largely because it's harder for them to mobilise the kind of finance that such projects require, whereas China can align its big banks and its big construction companies and its political intentions rather more easily. So, yes, that has increased its clout. It's brought problems too. It's brought problems of debt because China finances but doesn't actually pay for these projects, and so host countries have to pay back, and they don't always yield the return that is promised.
And we know that the US is strongly pushing Western allies to include in the final G7 statement the group's concern over China's industrial overcapacity. We've seen new regulations come in about Hong Kong and chip production. Tell us more about this.
Well, there's alarm, both, I mean, particularly in Europe, although Europe is characteristically not speaking with one voice on this. But China has been investing hugely in the production of certain key technologies. These include electric vehicles. They include pretty much everything you need to carry out the climate transition. So solar panels, wind turbines, and so on. And they're producing them much more cheaply than Western liberal democracies can. Now, of course, these countries in Europe and in the United States say this is unfair because this depends on state subsidy throughout the value chain. And if it is allowed to continue without tariffs, it will simply wipe out European and US industrial capacity. Now, the US has been rather ahead of the game with the IRA. It's the Inflation Reduction Act, which itself provides subsidies to US firms. The European Union is talking about tariffs, but is running up against problems with Germany, which exports huge volumes of traditional motor vehicles to China and is concerned about possible retaliation against that trade by China. So it is complicated. Nevertheless, the European Union mounted an inquiry into subsidies, concluded subsidies are unfair, and is about to bring very quite steep tariffs, depending on the degree of cooperation that the Chinese company concerned has offered. So we are in a very, very different position as far as global trade goes. But of course, the other concern is China's trade with Russia and how the degree to which that is fueling Russia's war machine in Ukraine.
I mean, Georgia, as Isabel says, does Europe speak with one voice? I mean, will there be a consensus on China and Russia, given the divergent views, particularly of the far right?
Exactly. We know that surely President Biden will try and push, and possibly his friend Giorgia Meloni will try to mediate with the other European allies to have a stronger voice and leave a tougher message to China to stop supporting Putin on this. And this is one of the big challenges, and this is one of the reasons why this summit happened, to convey all the leaders in one room and just try to have one common message going out to China in this case. So we'll see how, in the light of this weakness of Europe and refound strength of the far right, how these positions will be mediated. But definitely, this is what Biden is going to push for, a stronger action from Europe against China and the support to Putin.
And finally, Georgia, what would a G7 diplomatic win look like for Italy?
Well, first of all, by promoting the Made in Italy, which is not going to be hard. It's not a hard sell in Borgo Ignazia. But again, Giorgia Meloni started by saying that Italy can be an anchor in this time of chaos and uncertainty. So Italy now wants to be a protagonist and not a spectator on the international stage. So we've got this opportunity. Definitely, Giorgia Meloni wants to consolidate a role within it. So given that it is a crucial moment for Europe when the top jobs are going to be distributed, a victory for Italy will be proving that has a voice and that they can be a protagonist, a mediator, and the new force in Europe.
Georgia, thank you very much indeed. That's Georgia Scaturo and Isabel Hilton there. This is The Globalist. It's 8:12 in Khartoum, 7:12 here in London. In Sudan's western Darfur, El Fasher is the only city still under official army control. But the US envoy to the country has warned that it could fall to the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, in the latest stage of a civil war that's been ongoing for the last 14 months. Well, I'm joined now by Tara O'Connor, founder and executive director of Africa Risk Consulting, a pan-African consulting company. Tara, many thanks for coming back on the show. What do we know about what's going on in Al Fasher?
Well, it seems that all roads to Al Fasher have been closed off, and there's been a sustained attack on the city by the Rapid Support Forces, who are formerly known as the Janjaweed. And it seems as though, from what we can tell, is that they are systematically moving through the city, raising communities. I think the Yale humanitarian researchers are reporting that that whole areas and whole communities are being razed to the ground in the bid to take control of the strategic town.
Now, of course, the town, Al Fasher, has been a sanctuary for many who'd fled their homes because of the conflict. What's the situation for civilians there now, and where are people who are forced out of the city going to?
Well, it's a terrible situation for, there are people leaving the city to try and go and take refuge in existing internal displacement camps around the city. And beyond that, I suspect they will be moving towards the west of the country, which is under government control. Because if El Fasher does indeed fall, the whole of the Darfuri region is really then under the control of the RSF rebels, who have got a history of actually conducting attacks against civilians, and particularly against non-Arab speaking civilians.
And that's ethnic violence and genocide we've seen previously.
Indeed. I mean, 20 years ago, the Rapid Support Forces were previously called the Janjaweed, and they were a militia armed by the government, ironically, the government of Omar Bashir, and they were then responsible for a genocide when some 3,000 civilians in the region were killed.
And how imminent is the takeover, if indeed it is going to come at all? I mean, I'm guessing that a lot of information is very difficult to come by, given the inaccessibility now of the region.
Yes, it is very difficult to get information. I think there are certain organisations such as the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab who monitor communities and community movements by satellite and over an open source research that are actually giving some fairly credible information. What we do know is that there's some 30,000 official government troops, the Sudan Armed Forces troops, in the centre of the town. But as I said, it's surrounded, and I think it is it will imminently fall. I don't think really the government forces are relying on air attacks, and the 30,000 government troops are stuck in the heart of town, surrounded by RSF forces.
What's the situation in other parts of the country?
Well, with the RSF's control of most of Darfur now, and they've been consistently moving north towards Al Fasher with the idea of taking control of this vast province, which it largely gives them control of half of the country. So the country is pretty much split, with the government forces being based really in out of Port Sudan, and with these RSF rebels, which it should be remembered are backed by both Russia and by the UAE, are now in control of a vast area, and including 3 borders. They control 3 borders with Chad, Libya, and the Central African Republic in the west.
And what about humanitarian assistance? Is anything getting through? I mean, there's something like, 800,000 people in displacement camps around Al Fasher? Are they being helped in any way?
Well, it's extremely difficult to get anything through to the city. Médecins Sans Frontières is reporting that they are treating civilians. I think they've been treating something like 1,000 civilians who've been injured by largely indiscriminate mortar attacks. The city itself is a city of 2.8 million people, who will probably be, add to the 8 million displaced people that are now moving across Sudan. We forget that is actually something like 20% of the population on the move to avoid the conflict. So adding a further, several hundred thousands out of El Fasher would be particularly dangerous for them.
Now, we know that the UN is calling for a resolution on this, but I wonder what world leaders can do after largely neglecting the conflict.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. I think the first thing is to actually acknowledge that this is a conflict involving, 8 million displaced people, which is quite staggering. But I think fortunately, all sides are beginning to see, the international community led by the US is actually really pushing for peace talks to resume in Saudi Arabia. And the US is actually calling for all parties to be involved, including those that deny necessary involvement, including United Arab UAE, to become involved, Egypt, the regional blocs, sort of East African blocs, and the African Union to become involved in pushing for peace. I think a second thing is that there is room to extend. There are international sanctions in place, but I think international sanctions against all the belligerents, and particularly those that are supplying arms against international laws saying that arms should not be supplied to the conflict, that could be extended. And it's extraordinary that the General Dagalo, known as Hemeti, the RSF rebel leader, who is responsible for a lot of the civilian attacks against civilians, has escaped sanctions to date. He has extensive domestic and international business interests, in particular in gold mining. And then I think UAE's involvement in supplying the rapid support forces has largely gone unchallenged. So perhaps that would be a third to challenge UAE's involvement in supporting the RSF rebels. And finally, I would say world leaders could heed the Sudan Doctors for Human Rights, who are calling for an immediate cessation of violence and for access for a United Nations independent fact-finding mission to gather and analyse evidence on the recent atrocities and actually start holding those responsible accountable.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Tara O'Connor there. Now, still to come on the programme.
We share a lot of values of craftsmanship, functionality, accessibility, and it felt like they also had a profound interest in us.
We'll be in Copenhagen for the 3 Days of Design Festival. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is Tina Fordham, geopolitical strategist and founder of Fordham Global Insights. Good morning to you, Tina.
Good morning.
Let's start with Le Monde, and we're looking at political instability in France and the prospect of the RN coming to power and what that's doing to the markets.
Yes, it's quite remarkable and was not at all expected on the back of European parliamentary elections that Macron would call a snap election. He's only got a few weeks to mobilize public opinion in his favor, and he is effectively called the French public's bluff, expecting that when push comes to shove, they won't elect a majority government under him remaining as president. The problem is that the opposition RN is very comfortably in the lead, and financial markets are having a bit of a freak out, to use the technical term. Mm-hmm. And if we were to try to compare it to what happened here in the UK under Liz Truss's mini budget, the Institute Montaigne has suggested that the public deficit would grow by 3.9% of GDP under an RN-led government. Now, that's huge. And you're already seeing some instability in the FX markets there. So nobody was expecting this. It's not what anyone needs. And July is shaping up to be a much more interesting month in politics and in financial markets than anyone was expecting.
Let's go on to foreign policy now, talking about Modi and dissent.
Yes, well, again, the polls had predicted just a couple of weeks ago in the Indian elections that Narendra Modi would be re-elected to a third term with a consolidated majority. He ended up having his wings clipped by having to serve in government, but that hasn't stopped him from issuing what amounts to an ultimatum to the Indian press, saying that criticism would be regarded as dissent and punishable. So freedom of the press already getting rolled back under a Modi government in its third term.
We are going to look at a story that's covered by AP but been picked up by many papers, which is this fleet of Russian warships that are conducting Atlantic drills. They're on their way to Cuba.
Yes, shades of the Bay of Pigs. Cuba is saying nothing to see here, routine exercises. Russia is telegraphing that there are super-duper hypersonic ballistic missiles on board. And of course, the purpose of the exercise is to signal that Russia can bring military instability and its military might very close to the United States. So this is another source of pressure ahead of U.S. presidential elections, and another way that Russia is telegraphing its ability to project power beyond its borders.
Well, let's talk about those U.S. presidential elections. In Politico's West Wing playbook, there's an intriguingly headlined piece, The Magic 8 Ball of Presidential Races. What's that all about?
Yes, well, I loved the Magic 8 Ball when I was a kid, and you have to be a person of a certain vintage to remember the Magic 8 Ball, which you would shake up and it had some liquid and give you answers, saying things like, ask me tomorrow. I often wish as a political strategist I could use the Magic 8 Ball. But what was interesting about this initiative, which is two academics, one of whom is a professor of natural sciences, is that they've developed a system based on a number of keys to predicting U.S. elections. They have a very solid record. As a political science, I really like their approach. It's based on kind of factors that are, let's say politically neutral. And it suggests, although they emphasize they haven't made a formal call, that Biden is still in a strong position. And indeed, the polls only show Biden and Trump 1 point apart. And yet everyone that I talk to seems convinced of a Trump victory. So I saw this as a reminder that it's really too early in this very odd presidential contest to be convinced of either outcome.
Well, the slate goes with the headline, The Biggest Lie Trump-Biden Voters Tell Themselves. What is that? Well,
as an American long resident outside of my country, I tend to look at what's happening in the U.S. with what's called an inside-outside perspective. Most Americans comfort themselves with the idea, myself included, that the system will hold, that the institutions will remain, they will absorb the shock of the ups and downs of various candidates. And the Slate piece is suggesting that we shouldn't take comfort in that idea that the system will hold, that the institutions will insulate us. And I think it's a reminder that we can push things too far.
Well, taking comfort perhaps from religion, but the Pope says keep it snappy.
Yes, 8 minutes for a homily. I love this. I grew up having to go to Mass every Sunday, and I can assure you that no priest of my acquaintance kept his homily to 8 minutes. It reminded me a little bit of what Steve Jobs has said and other business leaders. So the Pope is saying 8 minutes or people fall asleep in the pews.
It's absolutely true. And he's also apologised after he used a really unfortunate term, which was faggotness or faggotry.
Yes, that was, I guess, a hot mic moment for the Pope. Some would argue that there is more that the Catholic Church needs to apologize for than the use of such a kind of a grubby term, to be honest. But yes, that was another recent escapade the Pope had to contend with.
And of course he's at the G7 today with his newfound interest in AI, so I expect we'll be talking about that very soon too. Tina Fordham, thank you very much indeed. Now here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said yesterday that Hamas had proposed numerous changes, some unworkable, to a US-backed proposal for a ceasefire with Israel in Gaza, but that mediators were determined to close the gaps. Meanwhile, Israeli forces stepped up air and tank bombardment last night in Rafah and central Gaza, residents said, as tanks advanced towards northern Rafah, which skirts the Egyptian border. Argentina's Senate passed a bill on Wednesday that's key to Libertarian President Javier Milei's economic reform plans, while protesters set fires and clashed with police in the streets outside Congress. Demonstrators who say the measures will hurt millions of Argentinians threw petrol bombs and stones, setting a car alight. The bill is expected to receive final approval today. And China's Premier Li Qiang was officially welcomed in a traditional ceremony in New Zealand's capital city of Wellington today, ahead of a meeting with the country's Prime Minister in the highest level Chinese visit in 7 years. New Zealand has toughened its stance on China this year, calling out Beijing for hacking the country's parliament and noting the growing threat China poses to security in the Pacific. And there's more on that story coming up in the briefing at noon London time. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It's 15:30 in Seoul, that's 7:30 here in London. To South Korea now, where the man considered to be a major contender in the next presidential election, the opposition leader Lee Jae-myung, has been indicted on bribery charges. He's also on a separate trial for corruption. Lee last made the headlines when he was seriously wounded in January by a knife-wielding attacker. I'm joined now by John Lee, who's editor of Korea Pro. John, many thanks for coming back on the show. He's a very interesting character, isn't he, Lee Jae-myung? He narrowly lost to Yoon Suk-yeol in the 2022 elections. Tell us a little bit more about him.
Well, as you said, the man is a very interesting character, and he is no stranger to any sorts of controversy. He's in court right now, and he's being charged with a fourth offense. He's been charged with corruption while he was a mayor of a city, and potentially getting someone to lie under oath for him. And now the latest charge against him is about transferring money to North Korea while he was the governor of Gyeonggi-do, right before he ran for the presidential election.
Do we have any details, apart from that, on this latest indictment?
Well, what happened here in Korea was that last week, his deputy, while he was serving as governor, has been sentenced to prison. He was sentenced to 9.5 years in prison. To give you the context of what happened, while he was governor of the Gyeonggi province, that was when all of these inter-Korean meetings and Donald Trump visiting North Korea was happening. And at the time, President Moon Jae-in visited North Korea, but Lee Jae-myung was not invited. He was not part of the list. And as a man who had presidential ambitions, he felt quite a bit miffed about that. And so he had set up this brand new position within the Gyeonggi province, within the governor's office, of an inter-Korean peace office, which had been unprecedented at the time. And the allegation that is at this point is that because he could not get funds from the province and hand it over to North Korea, because that would have been a violation of sanctions and all sorts of domestic laws. His deputy had spoken to a company called Sangbangmul, which is an underwear maker of all companies, and he convinced that company to hand over $8 million over to North Korea. Those $8 million were for partly to help North Korea begin their smart farm operations, and also to facilitate the meeting with Lee Jae-myung, or at least that's what the allegation is. And so the court sided with the prosecution, and they sentenced the deputy to 9.5 years in prison. Now the prosecutors are trying to prove that Lee Jae-myung was also in the know and that he had approved all of this money that has been sent over to the north.
So, I mean, we know there's heightened tension between the north and south at present. I mean, when is there not? But how is this case playing into that already febrile situation? I mean, particularly if it brings to light illicit activities involving political figures from both sides.
As of inter-Korean relations right now, the case against Lee Jae-myung doesn't really hold that much influence. The North Koreans have already stated several times that they do not trust any South Korean government official or party at this point, whether it's a conservatives or whether it's a progressives. And so the North Koreans have not said anything about this, and I doubt that they will. This is purely a South Korean domestic affair. It will hardly matter to the North Koreans at this point.
How is it then being covered in South Korea?
Well, in South Korea, as we said, Lee Jae-myung is no stranger to controversy. But that being said, he's also faced prosecution quite a number of times, and he has also once lost his parliamentary immunity in the National Assembly. Lawmakers are immune from prosecution unless their immunity is lifted by the majority of parliament, and he lost that immunity. But even after losing it, the court said it did not warrant an arrest warrant. And so the South Korean public has long been aware of his many different legal issues. And because of the hyper-partisan nature of South Korean politics, there is his core group of supporters who are absolutely convinced that all of these charges against him are being conjured up by the prosecution that are siding with the president at the moment. And so regarding this particular case, the different positions of South Korean voters have been fossilized for quite a long time at this point.
What has Lee himself said in terms of this possibly being politically motivated?
Lee has said that he has had nothing to do with the money being sent over to North Korea. And in fact, he has alleged that the company, that the underwear maker company, had sent over the money on its own accord in order to expand its own business motivations in North Korea. Now, how true is that? That remains to be seen. The courts will have to decide what that is, if that's the case or not.
What impact will this have on his political career? Can he still be in the running to succeed Yoon Suk-yeol?
Well, there is a good chance that he will still be in the running by 2027 because this, as I said, is the fourth court case that he's facing right now at the same time. And all of these three previous cases have been going on for a long time, some of them for over 3 years at this point. And so because this is going to be a very difficult case for the prosecution to prove, to state without a shadow of a doubt that he had full knowledge of the money being transferred over to North Korea. And so because this is likely going to be a very long process, there's a very good chance that the courts might not be able to come up with a sentence before the presidential election in 2027.
Very interesting. John Lee in Seoul, thank you very much indeed. You're with Monocle Radio. This week, Copenhagen has been hosting the annual 3 Days of Design Festival, and Monocle's correspondents have been out there meeting some of the brightest lights in the design world. Today, we bring you an interview with Christopher Juhl, who is the co-founder and managing director of Danish textile company Tekla. Tekla's teamed up with Finnish furniture brand Artek on a line of bed sheets. Monocle's Grace Charlton spoke to Christopher at the Tekla shop in Copenhagen.
I'm Christopher Juhl, and I'm the managing director of Tekla Fabrics. I've been with the company since the beginning. Charlie Hedin, our creative director, is sort of the founder, and I'm the co-founder of Tekla, the operational counterpart to his creativity, I think. But no, it's been 6 years into the journey now. I started 2 people in a basement, and now we're 35, so it's been quite a ride.
Is it only 6 years? That's crazy.
I think, yeah, we established the company back in 2017, and then we launched it throughout 2018, 2019. And then it went haywire during COVID, where we couldn't keep up, basically. It took us a few years to prove to be consistent, and insisting on this idea we had around elevated goods for the home, textiles for the home, and convincing people that they do play a very vital role. But then, when people started seeing consistency and coherency in our universe, they started believing in it. And then COVID was just sort of a really weird moment where you think that all of a sudden it's over, and then the next day it's to the moon, and you're like, shit, we can't keep up, and is production in Portugal going to continue? Is our dear colleagues on the floor, are they okay? It was just a bit mad. So yeah, now we're here. Yeah, it's been a fun ride.
I mean, I can speak from personal experience, but I never thought I cared about my sheets until Tekla made it a really design. I've got Tekla sheets at home. I've completely bought into your brand, and it's interesting to see how you've just taken off. But we're here for 3 Days of Design, and you're launching a new collaboration with Artek. Mm-hmm. How did this project come about?
So Artek, and specifically the Altos, which are sort of co-founders of Artek back in the day, I think they're around 90 years old, has always been a great source of inspiration for us. And Charlie has made Tekla a little bit of a sort of a collector of some of their items, and whenever we've had physical installations, whether in store, with customers, with B2B partners, and then now also in our showroom, we've always included Alto furniture, basically. So last year, for our first 3 days of design, the store had just been open for 1.5 months. We had connected with them to buy vintage pieces for the store, because they have this beautiful initiative of Second Cycle, where they sell upcycled pieces. So we bought some pieces for the store, and then it was just, we could kind of put words on our admiration for them, and that we feel like we share a lot of values of craftsmanship, functionality, accessibility, and it felt like they also had like a profound interest in us, and obviously being like with a lot less legacy than they have, but still, there was an interest. And last year we decided to keep it around Second Cycle, so we did a small collaboration around that. But then immediately after, there was a conversation around, can we do more? And that's really how sort of the initial ideation of this project we're launching today came about.
So the sheets have a very delicate, not quite straightforwardly floral, a little bit more abstract pattern. Can you tell me the story behind it? Because it's very charming.
Yeah. I mean, it is abstract indeed, which I also think is why it works so well in our universe. Even it's sort of our first sort of step into something other than stripes. But the story, I know, again, like the wife of Alvar did a lot of amazing work for Artec, but one of her big passions was textiles and prints. So back in like the early 30s, this pattern came to life as a gift for the wife of the Japanese ambassador in Finland. She was gifted a scarf upon a visit and a silk pattern, and she was very inspired by Kirsi cherry blossom print, and decided to do her own version and then gift it back to the ambassador's wife. So that's how it's almost 100 years old, 90-year-old pattern. Yeah.
And so you're also launching this collection in store in Helsinki, Tokyo, and Copenhagen, obviously as a nod to the story behind the print. How important is it for you guys to still have like the physical retail like touch points?
It's incredibly important. I mean, it took us years to open our first store here in Copenhagen. We weren't sitting on our hands or anything like that, but we had a lot of questions, right, when we started investigating, like, what is retail for Tekla and how do we make it special? Because it was, as you touched upon at the beginning, like, not a lot of people put any thought into elevated textiles for the home. So for that reason, like, the retail space was like very conventional. There was not a lot of exciting experiences out there. You bought it like maybe more or less like one way. It hadn't changed for decades. So when we entered the space, we realized that we had to find some sort of original angle on it, like Tekla, like what is retail at Tekla essentially was sort of the question we were asking ourselves. And one of the things that was a moment of epiphany, or for us, when we realized that service needs to be sort of at the heart of all conversations going on in store, that was really important to us. So we tried to build a retail space that caters for that. So we have a quite wide assortment. It's a tricky product to merchandise. I mean, fashion have the luxury of rails, and they can do a lot for them. We do have rails for certain part of our assortment, but like other parts of it are like big square pieces of fabric, and they're quite voluminous, and the tactility is incredibly important, the touch and feel. I mean, you rarely get surprised about the size of a towel. So that's not what we need to display, but we need to tell other stories. And that was challenging for us, and it's still growing for us, but the store is a great success. People have really embraced buying the products that we offer in a new environment and with a different experience attached to it.
That was Christopher Jewell, the co-founder and managing director of Danish textile company Tekla, speaking to our Grace Charlton. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Now it's time to talk television with Scott Bryan, a TV critic and broadcaster. Good morning to you, Scott.
Good morning.
Now, there's been a lot of industry chatter about a Paramount merger. What's the latest on this?
Well, I mean, it seems to be the case they might not be actually happening at all. I mean, Paramount, I think, is one of the smaller big media players. I mean, I'm saying smaller. It's a massive company worth billions. But if you look at the other US big firms, Netflix, Warner Brothers Discovery, it tends to be the case now that you would have to basically join with what used to be an arch rival to build up your content library, but also build up your share within Hollywood, your power share, just in order to survive the headwinds that are really affecting the industry at the moment because of the rise of streaming, but also because of declining cinema viewers. Also, just the fact that these days the competition on the internet is so fierce. So there's been a lot of talk for quite a long time that there was going to be a merger between Skydance, who make a lot of films such as the Mission Impossible films. They have also been doing quite a lot of Apple TV Plus series quite recently as well. And Paramount. Paramount owns CBS in the US. Paramount also owns Channel 5 in the UK. They also own a lot of the MTV channels. But according to a lot of insider reporting about different views, but also possible clashes in the boardrooms of these places, it seems to have unraveled and it's not going to be happening. And it could possibly mean that in Paramount's part, they could end up becoming quite a bit weaker. And I think it's also the case that at the time, if you are a subscription service user, you might have a subscription to Apple TV Plus, you might have a subscription to Amazon or to Netflix. You're less likely to have a subscription to Paramount. And I think it's the concern of, can that company now really still manage to have a foothold, or will it sort of wither away as these other companies with deeper pockets continue to spend?
Let's look at US TV viewing patterns, because Monday nights are suddenly big again.
Yes, they are. So, I mean, this is the interesting thing. If you watch TV late night, particularly liberal slanted programming, let's say 10, 15 years ago, you would have seen on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, and then Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. Fast forward to now, and on Monday nights in the US, the shows that are gripping quite a lot of people are Rachel Maddow on MSNBC and Jon Stewart back on The Daily Show again. And it seems to be the case that these shows, which used to be on daily and used to be providing a lot of commentary that would then get shared, have now been replaced by weekly shows with them because they're stepping back from other opportunities. Also in regards to Jon Stewart, he had a bit Apple TV deal he walked away from, so he's now returned to the show that made him famous in the first place. And I think at a time of great division within the US, I think viewers are flocking to these programs in a big way. And I think, excuse me, what's interesting is I think that maybe the appetite now is that people are happy to watch these shows weekly rather than daily, because I think daily shows, they can sometimes run out of steam. But also it does sort of maybe point towards that there is a lack of, maybe for next generation of comedians or liberal thinkers, maybe aren't really as coming through as they once were. I mean, these are essentially the same names providing great commentary. I think with Jon Stewart, I make a point to watch his show each week because it's now been shared on YouTube globally. But you do wonder about where the next Jon Stewart is going to come through, where the next Rachel Maddow is going to come through, if they're essentially the same people providing similar viewpoints of what was on TV more than 10 years ago.
No, absolutely. And let's have a look at the same sort of thing going on here in the UK, because, of course, we're ratcheting up to elections here too. But the UK TV debates don't seem to be having an impact on polling so far. Tell us what you've observed with all of this politics on TV and indeed the performances of the leaders of the parties.
So I think what is noticeable is just the abundance of election debates on TV at the moment. I mean, I think by my count, there's 7. And there's also the case that tonight there's another 7-party debate, aka Labour, the Conservatives, Lib Dems, and then also parties such as the SNP and the Green Party. So there was a lot to choose from. There was, of course, Keir Starmer versus Rishi Sunak having sit-down interviews with political editor Beth Rigby on Sky News yesterday. But they don't really all of these sort of sound bites and clips that then get shared and all of these viewpoints have not really seemed to change the polling numbers at all. And I think there's also the case that each format seems to be a little bit different than the last, sometimes to the viewers' benefit, and sometimes I think viewers don't necessarily win out. I think there was the head-to-head last week on ITV that some people sort of criticised for being sort of trying to cover way too much material in a very short space of time. I think an issue is that in the UK, political debates are different than how they're in the US. In the US, they are agreed by an independent sort of lobby or an independent group, which means that the debates are finalised months ahead of a presidential election. All the rules of the game are sort of very much confirmed by all sides, and also they're pretty rigid. I mean, you don't have to do them, but it seemed to be a big faux pas if you do. In the UK, they sort of seem to, at least, only really decide the format and whether they even have debates when the election is actually called. So that's why I think sometimes you can end up having a real scramble, and that's why you can then also end up having, I think, debates in which the viewer don't necessarily win, because it might be the case that you only have 30 seconds to have a good answer. It might be sort of maybe different rules and different formats for different broadcasters. And I think when it comes into this election, you could end up having too much, because I think there's quite a few. There's still a question time debate on the BBC upcoming. There's another debate on ITV tonight with all sets, with 7 party leaders, which is essentially the same as what it was on the BBC last week. And of course, when it comes to the polls, the Conservatives are still lagging behind. So you sort of wonder how much of a difference they actually make.
Absolutely. And I agree with you in the fact that there are just so much of it. There's so many debates. I feel I've got a new word for it. I am Sunakired of it all. Let's have a quick look at CNN, which is trying to cash in on the presidential debate ads.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the thing. There seems to be quite a lot of fatigue. I mean, it's surprising in which you've got the UK and the US election happening within the same year. I mean, I don't think that's happened for quite some time. I mean, of course, there was a chance that the US and the UK election were going to be roughly around the same time too, before Sunak decided to go and have the election over the summer. But it seems to be the case that actually CNN is having a big swing towards having a bit of income around the upcoming Joe Biden and Donald Trump debate, which has been talked about for quite a bit of month. They are expecting it to be blockbuster, but it's still very different than what it was 4 years ago. I think US networks now really do rely on US elections to really provide a massive amount of viewership and income. Maybe it's because of the people who are taking part in terms of not Sunak, in terms of Trump and Biden. But, I mean, the ratings are far, far down. The advertisers aren't seemingly interested until now. So you sort of wonder whether there's going to be a bit of surge towards polling day.
Absolutely. Scott, thank you very much indeed. That's Scott Bryan there. And you're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Although over the past few decades, Art Basel has made waves in Miami, Hong Kong and Paris, it's Art Basel in Basel that remains the year's preeminent art market event. Well, this year's edition featured 285 galleries, a host of satellite events and a brand new Art Basel shop. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs, who's Associate Editor of Monocle magazine and the producer of Monocle on Culture. She's just flown in back from Basel looking incredibly glamorous, but fresh-faced after all that partying and art and ready to talk to us about it. Sophie, what was the atmosphere like this year?
Well, I'm glad you're saying I'm fresh-faced. I don't agree with you, but that is fine. I got back late last night and the atmosphere this year was great. I think it was very lively. Lots of galleries seemed to have a bit of a disappointing year last year, and it seemed like there was a bit of a bounce back. It was also the first fair under the directorship of the new director, Micah Cruz. So she came in last year, but this was the first time that she was really in charge. And I think the thing that kind of defined that for me was making everything go a bit deeper. So lots of the kind of public events and public exhibitions and sites were staying on longer so that the actual population of Basel can enjoy them after the fair leaves. There was a more extensive nighttime programme. So the whole thing kind of felt a bit more expansive. It was less kind of flying in, lots of events and then leaving straight away. It all felt a little bit deeper. And also there was sunshine, which was lovely.
What about sales, though? How was the fair looking in terms of the market?
I think the market seemed to be pretty positive. There was a big sale in one of the preview days, this Joan Mitchell Sunflowers painting by David Zwirner, which went for $20 million. And that was one of the fair's most expensive works, and it sold very early on. So I thought that was a very kind of positive bellwether. I had a really great chat with another gallerist, Tadeusz Ropak. And he said that the sales were not like in 2022. That was a really kind of frenzied year post-pandemic. But he was actually very pleased about that. And he said that actually it felt like people, the collectors there, were taking their time, were being quite thoughtful about purchases. They weren't just kind of snapping something up because they wanted to get it before it disappeared. It actually felt like a bit more thoughtful. But obviously, as the fair goes on, works will be swapped out as things are sold. But yeah, I think in general, it felt very kind of optimistic, but a bit more measured.
What about events happening outside and around the fair?
So Basel as a city has such a huge array of art and museum institutions all year round, and they really come alive in the fair. And then on top of that, there's lots of other events as well. So I went to the Baylor Foundation, which is just a short tram ride away from the fair. And over the past few months, they've got this really amazing exhibition by lots of different artists, and it's taking over every space around the institution. It's a really beautiful building. It has really lovely grounds as well. And kind of everywhere you go, there's a new piece by different artists that you can experience, including places like the cloakroom and things like that. So it's quite lovely and kind of surprising in that way. And I spoke to the Nigerian-American artist Precious Okomoyan about this greenhouse which she created, which is so beautiful. But when I spoke to her afterwards, she said, actually, all the plants in there are very poisonous. Everything could kill you. It's it's very beautiful, but it has this kind of dark underside to it. And then I also wanted to kind of shout out Lister, which is a satellite fair. It's a kind of smaller, cooler, younger sister of Art Basel, really. And that's the place where you can see galleries from kind of lesser shouted about cities, places like Tartu in Estonia or Lima in Peru. And so there was some really interesting work on show there. And they had a book pop-up shop for the first time, which was from this Berlin-based bookshop called Do You Read Me? And that was really like a fantastic array of magazines and books and really great. So I spent quite a lot of time there in the end.
And that's the Art Basel shop?
That's not the Art Basel shop, but we can come on to the Art Basel shop because that is definitely worth highlighting. It's the very first time there's been a shop. So obviously if you've been to Art Basel before and you wanted to and are able to buy painting, that's fine. You can come away with something. But otherwise, everyone leaves empty-handed. And so the shop is curated by Sarah Andelman. She started Colette in Paris and then later Mise en Page. And it has really kind of lovely collaborations with artists. It has a really great book selection and quite interesting pieces as well. And I came away with a little dessert plate by their sort of artist they're working in collaboration with this year, Christine Sankim, who signed it for me as well, which is great. And it was a very sweet little takeaway.
Mm-hmm. Now, are there any artworks you would have smuggled home if you had the chance?
Well, part of the fair is called Unlimited. This is basically for the big stuff. It's a massive kind of area where galleries can bring in huge installations and things that you just would never be able to fit on a booth. And there was this really amazing series of photos by the Swiss-American photographer Robert Frank, part of his The Americans series. And they're all from the 1950s. They're all in black and white and just beautiful images of diners and gas stations. And they feel really kind of American and they're just so wonderful and full of life. And I actually sent our colleague Fernando a photo of one of them that was of this newsstand from the 1950s, which I loved as well. So I think probably I would take one of those. It also has the benefit of being able to fit in my suitcase. And there was a whole series. There was a lot there, but I actually would just be fine with one. So I think that is what I would choose if I had the chance. I think I would go for one of those.
And of course, we'll be hearing these reports on Monocle on Culture.
Yes, we have some of my interviews on Monocle on Culture, but also throughout our live shows as well. Lots of different interviews with gallerists, with artists, with also bookshop owners and other people working at Art Basel as well. So there's lots of coverage still to come.
Sophie Monaghan-Coombs, thank you very much. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Vincent McAviney, Laura Kramer and Henry Rees-Sheridan. Our researcher, George Ruskin, and our studio manager, Tamsin Howard. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday in London. We'll be looking at the Chinese state visit to New Zealand, also having a look at the Labour manifesto here in the UK. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.